Ethan Harris sat silently at the defendant's table, his hands tightly clasped, his knuckles white against the dim courtroom light. The words of the judge echoed in his mind. "The jury has found you guilty of armed robbery and assault." It was a phrase that had shattered his world just days before. Today, Ethan faced his sentencing hearing, where the possibility of spending the next 50 years behind bars loomed over him like a dark, unrelenting shadow. At just 28 years old, Ethan had dreams of building a better life for himself and his family. He worked double shifts at a local logistics company, saving every penny to one day open his own business. Yet, here he was convicted of a crime he swore he didn't commit. The charges were severe: an armed robbery at a convenience store and an assault that left the store clerk hospitalized. Despite maintaining his innocence, the evidence presented during the trial had painted him as the perpetrator. The courtroom was filled with an oppressive tension, thick and suffocating. Ethan's mother, Martha, sat in the front row, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue, her face etched with grief. His younger sister, Lily, sat beside her, silently praying, her lips moving without sound. Every glance they exchanged with Ethan seemed to scream, "This isn't right. This isn't who you are." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire Mathis, stood confidently at her table. She had already made her stance clear. Ethan deserved the maximum sentence. In her opening statement, she painted him as a danger to society, a man who had no regard for human life. Her words cut through the room like a blade, leaving Ethan's family visibly shaken. As the judge entered the room, everyone rose to their feet. Judge Marcus Bennett, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and tough sentencing, took his seat at the bench. His presence was commanding, his voice steady as he began the proceedings. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the precariousness of his future. When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his legs heavy with the weight of the moment. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, some filled with judgment, others with pity. Taking a deep breath, he began, his voice steady but tinged with desperation. "Your Honor," Ethan started, meeting the judge's gaze. "I stand here today convicted of crimes I didn't commit. I wasn't there that night. I was at work, clocking hours at my job like I've done every day for years. I have proof time cards, GPS records that show I wasn't anywhere near that store. But no one wanted to listen." He paused, his voice breaking slightly as he continued. "I understand that the evidence presented during the trial painted a different story, but I'm asking no, begging you to look deeper. I have a family, Your Honor. A mother who needs me. A sister who looks up to me. If you send me away for 50 years, you're not just punishing me, you're punishing them too." The room was silent, save for the quiet sniffles of his mother. Ethan's words hung in the air, raw and heartfelt, cutting through the otherwise cold proceedings. For a moment, even the prosecutor seemed to falter, her confident demeanor slightly softened. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Harris," he said, his tone measured, "I understand the gravity of your plea. But this court must base its decisions on the evidence presented during the trial. If you claim there is additional evidence, your defense team should have presented it at the appropriate time," Ethan's attorney, Michael Reed, interjected. "Your Honor, we intend to submit new evidence and request a review of the case. There are critical pieces of information that were overlooked, including a recanted eyewitness statement and GPS data that supports Ethan's alibi." The judge raised a hand, signaling for silence. "That may be addressed after today's proceedings. For now, this hearing is about determining an appropriate sentence based on the current conviction." Ethan sat down, his head lowered, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the judge's words. His mother reached out to him from the gallery, her fingers brushing his arm as tears streamed down her face. "Ethan, we believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll fight this. We won't give up." As the hearing continued, Ethan's mind drifted back to the night of the robbery. The details of the crime had never matched his reality, yet the system seemed determined to make him fit the narrative. How could the truth be so easily overlooked? How could his life be reduced to a few pieces of circumstantial evidence and a mistaken identification? The session ended with the judge announcing that sentencing would be finalized after further deliberation. As Ethan was led back to the holding cell, he glanced over his shoulder, meeting his mother's tearful eyes one last time. There was no mistaking the silent promise exchanged between them. This isn't over. The truth will come to light. The air in the courtroom was thick with a palpable tension as Ethan Harris sat quietly at the defendant's table. The walls seemed to close in around him, the weight of the prosecutor's words from earlier still ringing in his ears. Every creak of the wooden benches and every muffled cough echoed unnervingly, amplifying the oppressive silence that hung between each speaker's turn. The stakes were higher than ever. His life, his future, hung in the balance. Ethan's family was seated in the first row, a somber reminder of the life he had fought so hard to protect. His mother, Martha, sat clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. Her face, etched with years of hard work and sacrifice, now bore the added strain of heartbreak. She hadn't slept since the trial began, and it showed in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Beside her, Ethan's younger sister Lily nervously fidgeted with a charm bracelet Ethan had given her years ago. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, as though looking up might somehow confirm the nightmare unfolding before them. The prosecutor, Claire Mathis, stood confidently at her table, her crisp navy suit as sharp as her gaze. She embodied conviction, a woman who had made it her mission to ensure that Ethan would face the maximum penalty for his alleged crimes. She was calculating and methodical, her arguments designed to paint Ethan not just as guilty, but as irredeemably dangerous. Her voice, calm yet cutting, broke the silence as she reiterated her call for a 50-year sentence. "Your Honor," she began, her tone steady, "the evidence presented in this case leaves no room for doubt. The defendant was identified by an eyewitness and linked to the crime through circumstantial evidence. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a violent, premeditated act. To ensure justice for the victims and to protect our community, I urge this court to impose the maximum sentence." Her words reverberated through the room, each one landing like a blow. Ethan sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He wanted to scream, to shout that she was wrong, that he was innocent. But he knew any outburst would only confirm the picture she was painting of him. So he bit his tongue and stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding. Judge Marcus Bennett listened intently, his stern face betraying no emotion. Known for his strict adherence to the law and his tough sentences, he was not a man easily swayed. His presence was commanding, every movement deliberate. As he leaned forward to address the courtroom, the air grew even heavier, as if everyone present collectively held their breath. "Thank you, Miss Mathis," Judge Bennett said, his deep voice resonating in the quiet room. "The court acknowledges the severity of the charges and the impact on the victims. However, we must also ensure that the sentencing process is fair and just, taking all factors into consideration." The defense attorney, Michael Reed, stood next. He was an older man with graying hair and a demeanor that exuded both experience and compassion. His voice, though softer than Claire Mathis's, carried a conviction of its own. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge but glancing briefly at Ethan's family. My client, Ethan Harris, has consistently maintained his innocence. While the prosecution has presented its case, there are significant gaps and overlooked evidence that raise serious doubts about his guilt. We intend to submit additional evidence for review, including an eyewitness recantation and GPS data that was dismissed during the trial. A man's life should not be taken away based on questionable testimony and incomplete information. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder as Michael spoke. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and caught his mother's eye. Her face was a mixture of hope and fear, her lips pressed into a thin line as though holding back tears. Lily reached over and held her mother's hand, squeezing it gently, as if silently reassuring her that they would get through this together. Judge Bennett raised his gavel lightly, calling for order. This court will address the submission of new evidence after today's hearing. For now, the focus remains on sentencing based on the current conviction. Ethan's heart sank. It felt like every time a sliver of hope appeared, it was quickly snatched away. The room grew quiet again, the weight of the judge's words settling over everyone present. From the corner of the room, a lone spectator, a woman in her late 30s, watched the proceedings with a troubled expression. Her name was Megan, and she was the eyewitness who had originally identified Ethan as the robber. Though she hadn't spoken yet, her body language betrayed her inner turmoil. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The guilt of her uncertainty gnawed at her, but she remained silent for now. As the hearing adjourned for a brief recess, Ethan was led back to a holding area. He turned once more to see his mother and sister, their faces lined with determination. Their silent presence was a reminder of the stakes not just for him, but for them too. This wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. The courtroom, still cloaked in an air of tension, grew silent as Judge Marcus Bennett leaned forward from his bench. His stern expression was a mask of authority, his presence commanding respect from everyone in the room. Known for his no-nonsense approach and strict adherence to the letter of the law, Judge Bennett's reputation as one of the toughest in the district preceded him. To many, his name alone was synonymous with unflinching justice. But to Ethan Harris and his family, he represented a gatekeeper, one who held the keys to Ethan's freedom or a life behind bars. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows highlighted the lines etched into the judge's face, evidence of years spent presiding over cases that had shaped countless lives. To some, those lines were a testament to his fairness and dedication. To others, they were the marks of a man who rarely bent, even when bending might mean saving an innocent life. Judge Bennett's voice, low and steady, broke the stillness of the room. This court understands the gravity of the charges against the defendant, he began, his words measured and deliberate. The prosecution has presented a case that aligns with the evidence admitted during the trial. However, I am also aware of the defense's claims of overlooked evidence and procedural gaps. His gaze shifted to Ethan, who sat motionless at the defendant's table. Mr. Harris, the law requires this court to weigh all factors before delivering a sentence. That includes the impact on the victims, the evidence presented, and the potential for redemption. Ethan met the judge's gaze, his heart pounding. There was something in Judge Bennett's eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps, but it was fleeting. Ethan knew better than to mistake it for leniency. As the judge continued, his words carried the weight of authority. This case is not just about one man. It is about the integrity of our justice system. If there are valid concerns about the evidence or lack thereof, they must be addressed appropriately. But for now, this hearing is about the sentence. I expect all parties to remain focused. The prosecutor, Claire Mathis, straightened her shoulders, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Judge Bennett's tone, though neutral, hinted at a willingness to consider the defense's claims, a development that didn't sit well with her. She had built her case meticulously, believing the evidence was sufficient to secure not just a conviction, but the harshest sentence possible. Meanwhile, Ethan's attorney, Michael Reed, felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but the judge's acknowledgement of the defense's concerns was a step in the right direction. Reed had spent decades in courtrooms just like this one, fighting for clients who often felt like pawns in a system that valued expediency over truth. He knew better than to celebrate too soon, but he also recognized an opportunity when it presented itself. Martha and Lily Harris exchanged a glance from their seats in the gallery. The judge's words, though restrained, brought a sliver of relief. For weeks, they had felt invisible, mere spectators in a trial that had stolen their son and brother from them. But now, for the first time, it seemed someone was willing to acknowledge that things might not be as they appeared. Across the room, Megan, the eyewitness who had initially identified Ethan, sat quietly. Her stomach churned with unease. The judge's words only deepened her internal conflict. The certainty she had felt during the lineup had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing doubt that kept her awake at night. She hadn't meant for things to go this far, but now she wasn't sure how to make it right. As the hearing progressed, the tension in the room ebbed and flowed with each exchange. The prosecutor presented her arguments with precision, reiterating the impact of the crime on the victims and the community. Your Honor, we must consider the harm caused by the defendant's actions. The victims deserve justice. Anything less than the maximum sentence would undermine the severity of this crime, Michael Reed responded with equal fervor. Your Honor, justice is not served by rushing to judgment or ignoring evidence that could exonerate an innocent man. Ethan Harris is not the criminal the prosecution claims he is. He's a hard-working man with no history of violence or criminal behavior. The evidence we intend to submit will show that he was nowhere near the crime scene. Judge Bennett raised a hand, signaling for silence. This court will determine what is and is not relevant as the case proceeds. For now, I will review all arguments before making a decision on the sentence. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air as the room fell silent once more. Ethan's mother clutched her tissue tightly, her knuckles pale. Lily's hand trembled as she reached out to hold her brother's gaze, offering what little comfort she could from across the room. For Ethan, the hearing was yet another reminder of the fragility of his situation. Each moment felt like a test of endurance, a battle against despair. Yet, in the midst of it all, a quiet resolve began to take shape. If Judge Bennett was truly a man of justice, then perhaps there was still a chance, no matter how slim, that the truth would prevail. The courtroom grew still as Ethan Harris rose from his seat. The scrape of his chair against the wooden floor echoed through the room, drawing every eye to him. His heart pounded as he stood, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze remained steady. This was his moment, perhaps his only chance to tell his story. Ethan turned to face Judge Marcus Bennett, his voice low but resolute. Your Honor, he began, his tone carrying the weight of his desperation, I need you to hear me. Not as a convict, not as a case number, but as a man, an innocent man. The judge nodded, signaling for him to continue. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. I wasn't at that convenience store the night of the robbery. I was at work. I've been working double shifts for months, trying to save up to start my own business. My supervisor can confirm it, and there are GPS records from my phone that show I was nowhere near the crime scene. He paused, his voice catching. Your Honor, I understand that the evidence presented during the trial seemed convincing. But evidence can be flawed. Witnesses can make mistakes. I'm not saying this to disrespect the court or the victims, I'm saying it because it's the truth. The room was silent except for the faint scribbling of notes from a court reporter. Ethan's mother, Martha, sat in the gallery with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Beside her, Lily clutched the charm bracelet Ethan had given her, silently mouthing the words, "Stay strong." Ethan continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "I've worked hard my entire life to support my family. I've never been in trouble with the law. This isn't who I am. I've missed my sister's high school graduation because of this. I've missed holidays, birthdays. My family is being punished just as much as I am. And for what? For something I didn't do." His attorney, Michael Reed, placed a supportive hand on Ethan's shoulder, signaling him to keep going. Ethan looked directly at Judge Bennett, his eyes pleading but determined. "I know this court has a job to do. I know you have to rely on the evidence presented. But I'm asking you, begging you to give me the chance to prove my innocence. Please don't let this end with a mistake." The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. To most, it would have seemed cold, detached. But Ethan caught the faintest shift in the judge's demeanor, a flicker of something that could have been doubt or understanding. Across the room, the prosecutor, Claire Mathis, folded her arms, her expression skeptical. "Your Honor," she interjected, her tone sharp but controlled, "the defendant has had ample opportunity to present this supposed evidence. The jury's verdict was based on the facts of the case, and this court should focus on sentencing, not on revisiting a conviction that has already been decided." Michael Reed immediately responded, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, the defense intends to submit new evidence, including the GPS data my client referenced and an affidavit from the eyewitness who originally identified him. This evidence was either dismissed or not considered during the trial, and it is crucial to ensuring that justice is served." Judge Bennett raised a hand to quiet the attorneys. His gaze shifted back to Ethan. "Mr. Harris, while I appreciate your words, this court operates within the bounds of the law. If there is indeed new evidence, it must be submitted through proper channels. For now, this hearing is focused on determining your sentence based on the current conviction." Ethan nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly as he sat back down. The hope he'd carried into the courtroom felt fragile, like a thin thread threatening to snap. But he couldn't give up, not now, not ever. His mother's eyes met his, brimming with determination. Her silent message was clear: "We'll fight this. Together." The courtroom stirred as the judge announced a short recess. Megan, the eyewitness who had identified Ethan during the trial, sat in the gallery with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She hadn't spoken yet, but Ethan's words had struck a chord deep within her. She felt a growing unease, a gnawing doubt that refused to be silenced. What if I was wrong? The question loomed over her, heavy and inescapable. As the bailiff led Ethan back to a holding area, he glanced over his shoulder at his family. Martha raised her hand in a small, encouraging wave, while Lily mouthed the words, "Stay strong." It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Ethan that he wasn't alone in this fight. The break gave everyone a moment to reflect on what they had heard. For some, Ethan's plea was a heartfelt cry for justice. For others, it was a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his actions. But one thing was certain: the case was far from over. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as the defense team prepared to present the evidence they had tirelessly fought to bring to light. Michael Reed, Ethan Harris's seasoned attorney, stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of his determination. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and shifting gazes, now seemed to hold its collective breath, anticipating what was to come. Michael began, his voice firm yet measured. "Your Honor, today, I intend to shed light on critical evidence that was either dismissed or overlooked during the trial evidence that points to my client's innocence. The system's integrity depends on ensuring justice, not merely securing convictions. Judge Marcus Bennett gave a slight nod, his expression as unreadable as ever. The prosecutor, Claire Mathis, leaned back in her chair, her hands folded tightly, her sharp eyes locked on Michael. Ethan watched from his seat, his heart pounding in rhythm with the tension in the room. For weeks, he had clung to the hope that this moment would come, that the truth would finally have its chance to surface. Michael's first exhibit was a series of GPS records from Ethan's cell phone. "Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge but ensuring the entire courtroom could hear, "these records clearly show that Ethan Harris was miles away from the convenience store at the time of the robbery. His location data places him at his workplace, where he was clocked in and working a double shift." He walked toward the jury box, holding up the printed logs. These records were available during the initial investigation, but were dismissed as irrelevant. Yet, they provide a concrete alibi proof that Ethan could not have been at the scene of the crime. The courtroom stirred with quiet murmurs. Even Judge Bennett seemed to pause, leaning slightly forward to examine the documents presented. Ethan's family sat in the gallery, their hands clasped tightly together. Martha Harris whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, her eyes never leaving her son. Michael wasn't done. He gestured toward the gallery, where Megan, the eyewitness, sat with her hands folded nervously in her lap. "Additionally, Your Honor, we have new testimony from the eyewitness who initially identified my client. Megan has come forward to admit that her certainty in identifying Ethan has wavered. In fact, she is now unsure if Ethan was the man she saw that night." The murmurs grew louder, a wave of disbelief and curiosity rippling through the room. Megan hesitated, but eventually stood, her face pale and her hands trembling. I'm not sure anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "When I first identified him, I was scared, and it all happened so fast. But now, looking back, I don't think it was him." Her words struck the courtroom like a thunderclap. Ethan turned to face her, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and relief. The weight of her statement hung heavily in the air, challenging the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Claire Mathis, ever composed, rose to her feet. "Your Honor, eyewitnesses are not infallible, but the identification was not the sole basis of the conviction. The evidence presented during the trial remains valid." Michael countered swiftly. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case heavily relied on that identification. If the eyewitness is now uncertain, it casts doubt on the entire narrative presented to the jury. Combined with the GPS evidence and other overlooked details, it's clear that a miscarriage of justice has occurred." Judge Bennett held up his hand to silence the escalating back and forth. "Enough. This court will examine the validity of the new evidence in due course. For now, I will allow the defense to continue presenting its case." The next piece of evidence was employment records from Ethan's workplace. Michael handed copies to the judge and prosecutor. These records confirm that Ethan was indeed clocked in at work during the time of the robbery. His supervisor, who is prepared to testify, can corroborate this. The courtroom grew quieter still. Even the skeptical faces in the gallery began to shift, some showing doubt about Ethan's guilt. Claire Mathis's expression hardened, but she remained silent, her mind clearly racing as she recalibrated her strategy. Ethan sat at the defense table, his hands resting on his lap. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope, like a small but steady light piercing through the darkness that had enveloped him. He glanced at his mother and sister, who returned his gaze with cautious optimism. As Michael concluded his presentation, he turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we are not asking for leniency or sympathy. We are asking for the truth. If there is any doubt, any possibility that Ethan Harris is innocent, then this court has a duty to act. Justice is not served by convicting an innocent man. The weight of his words settled over the room. Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of deep thought. "This court will take a recess to review the evidence presented," he announced, his voice steady but firm. "We will reconvene shortly." As the judge exited the room, Ethan let out a shaky breath. His mother reached over the gallery railing, her hand brushing his arm as tears streamed down her face. "We believe in you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't lose faith," Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't know what the next steps would bring, but for the first time, he felt like the truth had a chance to be heard. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the hearing resumed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and even those standing by the door leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Tension hung thick in the air, as if the entire room was holding its collective breath. Ethan Harris sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The weight of hope and fear pressed down on him as he awaited the next revelation in his case. Michael Reed, Ethan's defense attorney, rose to his feet. His measured steps carried him toward the witness stand, where Megan, the prosecution's key eyewitness, was seated. Megan's hands rested nervously on her lap, her fingers twisting together in a restless dance. Her gaze flitted around the room, but she avoided looking at Ethan. Michael's voice was calm but firm. "Megan," he began, addressing her with a tone that carried both respect and purpose, "you testified during the trial that Ethan Harris was the man you saw leaving the convenience store on the night of the robbery. Is that correct?" Megan nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, that's what I said." Michael stepped closer, his tone softening. "And do you still stand by that statement today?" Megan hesitated, her throat working as she swallowed hard. Her eyes darted briefly to Ethan, and for a moment, guilt flickered across her face. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "At the time, I was scared. The robbery happened so fast, and when the police asked me to identify someone, I thought he looked like the man I saw. But now, I'm not so sure anymore." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the disbelief palpable. Ethan's mother, Martha, covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and anguish. Lily, seated beside her, reached over to squeeze her hand, her own tears brimming. Across the aisle, Claire Mathis, the prosecutor, stiffened, her expression a mask of controlled frustration. Michael pressed gently. "Megan, what changed? Why are you now uncertain about your identification?" Megan looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. "I've thought about it every day since the trial. I replay that night over and over in my head, and I just don't feel certain anymore. I don't want to ruin someone's life if there's even a chance I was wrong." Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the courtroom. Ethan's heart raced as he watched the woman whose testimony had condemned him now question her own certainty. For the first time, he felt the fragile threads of justice beginning to shift in his favor. Michael turned to address Judge Marcus Bennett. "Your Honor, the prosecution's case heavily relied on Megan's identification of Ethan Harris. Her doubt now undermines the credibility of that testimony and calls the entire conviction into question." Judge Bennett leaned forward, his hands folded on the bench. His face remained impassive, but his eyes were sharp, assessing every word. "Miss Mathis," he said, turning to the prosecutor, "what is your response to this development?" Claire Mathis stood, her composed exterior betraying no sign of the growing cracks in her case. "Your Honor," she began, "while the eyewitness's testimony is a key component of the case, it is not the only evidence. The jury's decision was based on multiple factors, not just Megan's identification. Michael countered immediately. Your Honor, with all due respect, the foundation of the prosecution's case was built on this testimony. Combined with the new evidence we've presented, GPS data, employment records, and now the eyewitness's uncertainty, it is clear that a serious miscarriage of justice has occurred. The room was silent as Judge Bennett considered the arguments. His gaze shifted from Michael to Claire, then to Megan, whose trembling hands betrayed the weight of her guilt and doubt. Finally, his eyes landed on Ethan, who sat quietly, his face a mask of quiet resolve. After a long pause, Judge Bennett spoke. This court takes eyewitness testimony very seriously, as it often plays a pivotal role in criminal cases. However, we must also acknowledge its limitations and the potential for error. In light of the new evidence and the eyewitness's wavering certainty, I am ordering a thorough review of all evidence presented during the trial. The room erupted in murmurs, the tension breaking like a dam under the weight of the judge's decision. Ethan's mother let out a sob, her hand flying to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Lily wrapped her arms around her mother, her own tears falling freely. Megan sat frozen in the witness chair, her face pale but her eyes resolute. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She had spoken her truth, and it had not been in vain. As the hearing concluded, Ethan was led back to the holding area. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, meeting his mother's tearful gaze. Her silent message was clear: we're not giving up. For Ethan, the judge's decision felt like a lifeline thrown into a turbulent sea. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was hope. And for the first time in months, hope felt like enough. The courtroom was hushed, the weight of Judge Marcus Bennett's recent decision still settling over everyone. His ruling to review all previously denied evidence had created ripples of hope and doubt among those present. For Ethan Harris, it felt like a single step forward on a path that had been obscured by injustice for far too long. Though the battle was far from over, the prospect of his truth being heard filled him with cautious optimism. Judge Bennett sat with an air of authority, his expression stern, as always, but now tinged with a sense of purpose. He tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the beginning of the next phase of the proceedings. This court recognizes the importance of justice over expedience, he announced, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Therefore, I am ordering a comprehensive review of all evidence, including the items that were previously excluded during the trial. Murmurs filled the room, a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Ethan's mother, Martha, clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white. She turned to her daughter, Lily, who sat beside her with tears brimming in her eyes. "This is it," Martha whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and disbelief. This could change everything. Claire Mathis, the prosecutor, stood with measured poise. "Your Honor," she began, her tone firm but respectful, "while I understand the court's decision, I must emphasize that the evidence presented during the trial was sufficient to secure a conviction. Revisiting this material sets a dangerous precedent and risks undermining the work of the jury." Judge Bennett's gaze sharpened, his tone unwavering. "Miss Mathis, this court is not questioning the jury's work. However, it is my responsibility to ensure that every piece of relevant evidence is considered. Justice demands nothing less." Michael Reed, Ethan's defense attorney, seized the moment. "Your Honor, we are prepared to submit the new evidence immediately. This includes surveillance footage from a nearby business that corroborates Ethan's alibi, as well as additional testimony from the eyewitness who has recanted her original statement." At the mention of the surveillance footage, The gallery stirred again. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He had known about the footage for weeks, but it had been dismissed during the trial as irrelevant. Now, it had the chance to become a lifeline, a beacon of truth in a sea of doubt. As the bailiff distributed copies of the defense's new submissions, Judge Bennett studied the documents before him. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone measured, "this surveillance footage, how was it initially excluded from the trial?" Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but edged with frustration. "Your Honor, the footage was deemed inadmissible due to procedural issues. However, it clearly shows my client entering his workplace at the time the robbery occurred. It is vital evidence that was unjustly overlooked." Ethan watched as the judge examined the still frames provided from the video. Though the footage wasn't crystal clear, it undeniably showed a man entering the building, a man who bore a striking resemblance to him. Ethan's heart pounded as he saw the glimmer of doubt in the judge's eyes. The next piece of evidence was presented, a sworn affidavit from Megan, the eyewitness who had publicly expressed her uncertainty. Michael read aloud from her statement, his voice steady and deliberate. "I no longer have confidence that Ethan Harris was the man I saw leaving the convenience store on the night of the robbery. My initial identification was made under stress and fear, and I now believe I may have been mistaken." The room fell silent again. Megan sat in the gallery, her face pale but resolute. She met Ethan's gaze for the first time, her expression apologetic. Ethan gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need words to convey his gratitude or courage to admit her doubts had given him a fighting chance. As the evidence was reviewed, the courtroom shifted from a place of doubt to one of possibility. Even the most skeptical faces in the gallery began to soften. Martha reached over to clutch Ethan's hand as he was led past her during a brief recess. "We're getting closer," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can feel it." Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to respond. The weight of his family's belief in him was both a comfort and a burden. He couldn't let them down, not now, not ever. When the proceedings resumed, Judge Bennett addressed the courtroom with a tone that carried the gravity of his decision. "This court finds sufficient cause to reopen the examination of the evidence. I am ordering a full review of the surveillance footage, GPS records, and additional testimony provided by the defense. Furthermore, I will allow the defense to call witnesses who can corroborate Mr. Harris's alibi." The announcement was met with a mixture of quiet cheers and hushed disbelief. Claire Mathis remained seated, her expression tight but professional. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her case was unraveling. Meanwhile, Michael Reed allowed himself a small smile, a sign of hope, but also a reminder of the work still ahead. As Ethan was led back to the holding area, he glanced over his shoulder at his mother and sister. Their faces shone with quiet determination, a reminder that this fight wasn't just for him, it was for them, for truth and for justice. The courtroom was abuzz with hushed conversations and the restless shuffling of papers as Judge Marcus Bennett signaled the resumption of the hearing. The defense was ready to present the new evidence in its entirety, evidence that could dismantle the prosecution's case against Ethan Harris. For Ethan, this moment felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, one step closer to freedom, but also a step closer to heartbreak if things didn't go as hoped. Michael Reed, calm and composed, approached the center of the courtroom. He held a stack of documents and a USB drive containing surveillance footage, his expression one of quiet determination. "Your Honor," he began, addressing Judge Bennett with unwavering confidence, "we now submit the complete surveillance footage and corroborating GPS data that support my client's innocence." Judge Bennett nodded, gesturing for the bailiff to retrieve the evidence. The prosecutor, Claire Mathis, maintained her stoic demeanor, though her hands tightened around her pen. The courtroom gallery grew silent, every pair of eyes fixed on the screens as the footage began to play. The grainy video from a nearby business captured a time-stamped image of Ethan entering his workplace at precisely 9:47 p.m., the same time the robbery was taking place miles away. The footage was irrefutable, showing Ethan dressed in his work uniform, greeting a coworker at the door. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Michael paused the video and turned to the jury box, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a recreation or a simulation. This is real-time surveillance footage that places my client at his workplace at the exact moment the crime occurred. There is no conceivable way he could have committed the robbery." Ethan's mother, Martha, let out a quiet sob, pressing a hand to her mouth. Lily leaned over, gripping her mother's arm, her own tears threatening to fall. For the first time in weeks, hope felt tangible, like a light breaking through the darkest storm. Claire Mathis rose to her feet, her tone sharp. "Your Honor, while the footage is compelling, it does not account for the possibility of my client leaving his workplace afterward. We cannot base an acquittal solely on this video." Michael responded swiftly, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honor, we anticipated this argument, which is why we are also submitting GPS data from Ethan's phone. The data logs show continuous movement within the workplace during the hours in question. Combined, these pieces of evidence establish an unassailable alibi." The courtroom grew quiet again as the GPS data was presented. Dots marked Ethan's phone's location, each timestamp confirming his presence at work. The evidence painted a clear picture. Ethan was nowhere near the convenience store when the robbery occurred. Judge Bennett studied the evidence carefully, his expression unreadable. "This court recognizes the significance of this evidence," he said, his voice even. "Miss Mathis, do you have any objections to its authenticity?" Claire hesitated, clearly weighing her options. "No, Your Honor," she replied reluctantly, her tone clipped. "However, I maintain that the jury's original verdict was based on a broader range of evidence." Michael didn't let the moment pass. "Your Honor, the jury's decision was made without this crucial evidence that was wrongfully dismissed during the trial. It is only fair to reconsider the verdict in light of the truth." The next witness called to the stand was Megan, the eyewitness who had previously recanted her testimony. She took her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Michael approached her with a kind but purposeful tone. "Megan, earlier in this hearing, you expressed doubt about your initial identification of Ethan Harris. Can you elaborate on why you feel that way now?" Megan nodded, her voice shaky but firm. I thought I was sure at the time. But looking back, everything happened so fast. The man I saw was wearing a hoodie, and his face was mostly obscured. When the police showed me the lineup, I felt pressured to choose someone, and I made a mistake." Her words echoed in the courtroom, drawing gasps from the gallery. Ethan watched her, his heart swelling with gratitude. Megan's courage to admit her mistake, despite the scrutiny she faced, felt like a lifeline he hadn't expected. Claire Mathis cross-examined Megan, her tone professional but pointed. "Megan, are you saying you no longer believe Ethan Harris is guilty, despite your original testimony under oath?" Megan met Claire's gaze, her expression resolute. "Yes," she said firmly. "I no longer believe he is guilty." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom. Ethan's family clung to each other, their emotions raw. Even the most skeptical members of the gallery began to shift uncomfortably, the cracks in the prosecution's case now impossible to ignore. As the defense concluded their presentation, Michael turned to Judge Bennett. "Your Honor, the evidence presented today, combined with the recanted testimony of the eyewitness, not only casts reasonable doubt, but also establishes my client's innocence. Ethan Harris has spent months fighting for his life, and it is clear that he should never have been convicted. Judge Bennett took a long moment, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. His deep voice broke the silence. This court will recess to review the evidence in its entirety. A ruling will be issued promptly. As the judge exited, Ethan turned to his attorney, his voice filled with cautious hope. "Do you think this will be enough?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's more than enough, Ethan. Now, it's up to the court to do what's right." For Ethan, the wait was agonizing, but for the first time in months, he felt the truth gaining momentum. This was no longer just a fight for his freedom, it was a fight for justice, a fight to prove that the system could correct its mistakes. The courtroom was alive with anticipation, every seat filled and every corner buzzing with quiet whispers. After hours of deliberation, the moment of truth had arrived. Judge Marcus Bennett returned to his bench, his presence as commanding as ever, though his expression betrayed a hint of the gravity of the decision he was about to deliver. For Ethan Harris, this moment felt both agonizingly slow and heartbreakingly swift. The future, uncertain yet tantalizingly close, hung in the balance. "Order in the court," Judge Bennett announced, his deep voice cutting through the murmurs. The room fell silent instantly, all eyes turning toward him. His gaze swept across the room, pausing momentarily on Ethan, who sat at the defense table. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together, his heart pounding in his chest. His mother and sister sat behind him, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. "This court has thoroughly reviewed the new evidence submitted by the defense," Judge Bennett began. His tone was measured, each word deliberate, as though he understood the weight they carried. The surveillance footage, GPS data, and recanted eyewitness testimony collectively introduced significant doubt into their original conviction of Mr. Harris. Ethan's breath caught. He could feel his mother's eyes on him, her unspoken prayers filling the space between them. Lily leaned closer to her, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear. They both clung to the hope that had eluded them for so long. Judge Bennett continued, "It is the duty of this court to ensure that justice is served, and justice cannot exist in the presence of doubt. Therefore, I am overturning the conviction of Ethan Harris. He is hereby exonerated of all charges." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the room itself needed time to absorb their weight. And then, like a dam breaking, the courtroom erupted into cheers and gasps of relief. Martha let out a sob, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Lily hugged her tightly, both of them overcome with emotion. Ethan sat frozen for a moment, the reality of what he had just heard struggling to take hold. His attorney, Michael Reed, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his voice steady and filled with pride. "Ethan," he said softly, "it's over. You're free." Slowly, Ethan stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He turned to face his family, his mother's tear-streaked face the first thing he saw. She rose from her seat, rushing toward him as if nothing could keep her away. When they embraced, the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the overwhelming relief and love between them. "Oh, Ethan," Martha sobbed, holding him tightly. "I knew you didn't do it. I knew it." Lily joined them, wrapping her arms around her brother and mother, her own tears falling freely. "We never stopped believing in you," she whispered. Not for a second. The scene was one of raw and filtered emotion, the kind of moment that leaves an indelible mark on everyone who witnesses it. Even some of the court staff and gallery members wiped at their eyes, unable to remain unaffected by the sight of a family reunited after months of unimaginable pain. Judge Bennett's gavel brought the room back to order, though his tone carried a rare note of empathy. "Mr. Harris," he said, addressing Ethan directly, "the system failed you, and for that, this court owes you an apology. While I cannot undo the time you have lost, I hope this decision provides you and your family with a sense of justice and the opportunity to rebuild your life." Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion as he replied, "Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for giving me a chance to prove the truth." As the courtroom began to clear, reporters and spectators lingered, their conversations buzzing with the implications of the case. For Ethan, the overwhelming noise barely registered. All that mattered was the warmth of his mother's embrace and the knowledge that his nightmare had finally ended. Michael Reed stayed behind to speak with reporters, emphasizing the importance of revisiting evidence in criminal cases and the systemic flaws that had led to Ethan's wrongful conviction. "This isn't just about Ethan," he told the crowd. "This case highlights the need for change, for better oversight, for fairness, and for ensuring that the justice system truly serves its purpose." Megan, the eyewitness whose recanted testimony had played a pivotal role, approached Ethan as he stood outside the courtroom with his family. Her steps were hesitant, her guilt evident in the way she avoided his eyes. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Ethan looked at her, his expression a mix of weariness and grace. "You did the right thing," he said simply. "That's what matters." Megan nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I hope you can forgive me." Ethan hesitated, but then offered a small, understanding smile. "I already have." As the Harris family stepped out into the sunlight, a wave of reporters surged toward them, microphones and cameras flashing. Ethan shielded his eyes, his hand resting protectively on his mother's shoulder. But amid the chaos, there was peace, a quiet, unshakable peace that came from knowing the truth had finally prevailed. Ethan Harris stood on the steps of the courthouse, the afternoon sun casting a golden light over the crowd that had gathered. Reporters thrust microphones toward him, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of questions. His mother and sister stood close by, their expressions a mix of relief and pride. Ethan had been exonerated, but the road ahead was clear. It wasn't just about his freedom anymore. His story had ignited a conversation that demanded change. Taking a deep breath, Ethan raised his hand, signaling for silence. The crowd quieted, their attention fully on him. His voice was steady but laced with emotion as he began. "Today, justice was served not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been wrongfully accused, for every family torn apart by a system that prioritizes convictions over truth." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. "I'm grateful for my family, for my attorney, Michael Reed, and for everyone who believed in me when it felt like the whole world had turned against me. But I shouldn't have had to fight this hard to prove my innocence. No one should." The reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Ethan's case had already become a lightning rod for conversations about the flaws in the criminal justice system. The reliance on eyewitness testimony, the dismissal of critical evidence, and the pressure to close cases quickly were now under intense scrutiny. Michael Reed stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ethan's case is not unique. It's a tragic example of what happens when the system fails to prioritize fairness and thoroughness. Eyewitness testimony, while valuable, is not infallible. Evidence must be examined with the utmost care, and above all, the presumption of innocence must remain at the heart of our justice system." Ethan looked at Michael, gratitude shining in his eyes. He turned back to the crowd. "For months, I sat in a cell, wondering if I'd ever get the chance to tell my story. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who doesn't have a voice, who doesn't have someone fighting for them. We need to do better, not just for those of us who are innocent, but for the integrity of justice itself. As the crowd applauded, Martha Harris wiped a tear from her cheek. Her son's words filled her with pride, but also with a deep sense of resolve. She had seen firsthand the pain and fear that came with being powerless against the system. Now, she was determined to help other families avoid the same ordeal. Among the spectators was Megan, the eyewitness whose courage to admit her doubts had been pivotal. She stood quietly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The guilt she carried was still heavy, but hearing Ethan's words gave her a sense of purpose. She had made a mistake, but now she could work to ensure others wouldn't face the same fate. The ripple effects of Ethan's case began almost immediately. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the systemic issues that had led to his wrongful conviction. Advocacy groups reached out to him, inviting him to share his story at events and conferences. Ethan, once a man struggling to survive in a system that seemed determined to destroy him, now found himself at the center of a movement. A month later, Ethan stood in front of a packed auditorium, addressing an audience of lawmakers, legal professionals, and community advocates. His voice was strong, his words resonating with those who had gathered to hear him speak. "We need change," he said, his tone passionate. "We need better standards for evidence. We need to acknowledge the fallibility of eyewitness testimony and the biases that can creep into investigations. And above all, we need to remember that every defendant is a person, a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister. When the system fails, it doesn't just affect one person. It ripples out to families, to communities." His speech was met with a standing ovation. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan worked tirelessly to advocate for reforms. He partnered with organizations dedicated to criminal justice reform, lent his voice to campaigns for policy changes, and supported families going through similar battles. For Ethan, the journey was far from over. He carried the scars of his ordeal, but he refused to let them define him. Instead, he used his experience to inspire others, to push for a system that valued truth and fairness above all else. Back home, in the quiet moments with his family, he often reflected on how close he had come to losing everything. He found strength in the love and support that had carried him through the darkest days. His mother, Martha, often reminded him, "Your story isn't just about what happened to you, Ethan. It's about what you've done with it." One evening, as he sat with Lily on their front porch, she turned to him with a small smile. "You know," she said, "when all of this started, I used to pray every night that we'd get you back. Now, I think maybe God had a bigger plan for you to help others, not just yourself." Ethan nodded, his heart full. "Maybe you're right," he said. "I didn't choose this, but I can choose what I do with it." Ethan's case became a turning point in the fight for criminal justice reform. His journey from despair to hope, from injustice to advocacy, served as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of fighting for what's right. His story didn't just inspire change, it became a beacon of hope for countless others, proving that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth can shine through.